Hello, I want to talk about the early civil rights movement in this country. There's this common misconception that the civil rights movement for equal rights for access to education and employment began for African Americans sometime around the 1950s. This is simply not true. What happened in the 1950s is they began to have some success. But the fight for civil rights and equality actually began long before then, and it began in a couple different places in a couple different ways. Some of the early movement people in the movement were people like Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a muckraker, and she wrote a series of articles called A Red Record. And A Red Record talked about the number of lynchings or extrajudicial killings, murders, actually, that were perpetrated across the South against African American communities. And how this really had nothing to do with enforcing justice so much as it had to do with enforcing social order and fear. And so, and she presented statistics, she presented information that came from reliable sources to demonstrate these things. Another important early civil rights movement was a person named Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was born a slave. And as a slave, he was emancipated at the end of the war, Civil War, and he would go on to be one of the most important people for education in the late 1800s because he was first an instructor, then the leader of the Tuskegee Institute. The Tuskegee Institute is a historically black college who was one of the very few places where African Americans could come and get an education. And they began first by focusing on vocational skills because Booker T. Washington believed that for African Americans to become equal, they needed to demonstrate their value to society to the white person. And so that by being economically integrated with one another, that would help level the playing field and would ensure equality. And he was willing to accept a level of segregation in personal lives to help secure that integration on an economic level. But one person who very strongly disagreed with him, and unfortunately for Booker T. Washington outlived him by 40 years, was a guy by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was born and raised in the North, and so his perspective on race relations was very different, and he believed that African Americans had absolutely nothing to prove. They should not have to prove their worthiness of their rights as guaranteed under the Constitution, that was, well, kind of racist an idea. And this idea that they are guaranteed these rights, they just need to go out and claim them. And even if that meant doing so in going to courts and doing some things like this. He's going to be one of the founders, along with Ida B. Wells, of the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And they're going to start by they're actually going to be the organization that is going to lead to a lot of early successes in the civil rights movement later in the 1950s and later on from there. But it is a civil rights movement, and there is this, it wasn't that African Americans and other minorities were content with their segregation. They just really weren't having a lot of success fighting it. In fact, when they did try to fight it, it went very badly against them. And probably the ultimate situation with that was the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. All right, so Plessy was 1/8 African American. His great grandfather was African American. All the other ancestors were European, and they had a law in where he was at that segregated people of color, as they called them, from whites in railroad cars, that if you got onto a railroad car, that you were not allowed to sit in the whites only area. All right. And he challenged that on two grounds. Number one, it was unfair. Number two, he was 7/8 white. And he was arrested. And so he sued, saying that he had been mistreated and it was a violation of the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment, of course, says that you can't treat citizens differently, that citizens, you're either a citizen or you're not a citizen, but you can't be a half citizen. And what's more is if you're a citizen of the United States, you're automatically a citizen. The rights of a citizen of the United States apply to everybody, everywhere within the United States, within any of the states, I guess I should say. Anyway, and so what happens is that it ends up going all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in what has got to be one of the worst cases ever, worst decisions ever, decides that Plessy was treated very fairly, that there should be this thing called separate but equal, and that segregation laws really should be considered legal under the Constitution, because we're not treating them any differently just because we're keeping them away from us, kind of thing. And that we would say it was that doing that was not a violation of the Equal Protection Clause under the Fifth or the 14th Amendments. Now, we may disagree with that, and in fact, I do, in large part because separate was never equal. It's an amazing. They may say, okay, we have a car for Africans, Americans, and Hispanics, and Asians, and what have you, and then we have a car for white people over here. But you know what? There's only 5 people in the white car, and there's 50 in the colored car. That doesn't sound like it's very fair to me. That's not very equal. And this one over here may have 3 porters. This one over here may have no porters or 1 porter to. And that car is at the end of the train, and maybe it's a little hotter, maybe it's getting a little smoke. All right, segregated schools. We had segregated schools all across the country. Well, how they were segregated differed by where you were at, but you ended up with this situation where schools for minorities often got all the cast outs and hand-me-downs from the white school. White schools would get new textbook, other schools would get last year's textbook. The white school would get new desks, and they'd pass all the other desks over to the other school. And so separate was never, ever equal. And these are some of the things that they were trying to fight in the civil rights movement. In this early civil rights movement, was trying to fight this idea of segregation. All right. Another thing is prison reforms. What would end up happening is all across the South, they passed a bunch of laws limiting your mobility if you were a former slave or a descendant of that person, and passing laws like, for example, loitering laws. Loitering laws basically say that you're not allowed to stand still. You cannot stand still and be in the same place for 5 minutes without proving you have a legitimate reason to be there. And so oftentimes what would happen is the police would arrest a person for loitering, and they would go to prison. And when they were in prison, the prison warden could loan you out to local farmers or local mining companies or lumber companies, and you would work without wages, doing this backbreaking, miserable work in the sun. And if you refused to go, that you could be beaten. You were chained together in the chain gangs and working for other people, not getting any of the wages yourself. If this sounds a lot like slavery, that's what some of the people 100 years ago were saying, and that's still what some people say today, is this idea that, we got rid of slavery under the 13th Amendment. We got rid of slavery. So we had to find a new way to enslave people, and we did that through the prison system. And so they're fighting against that. They're fighting against, mostly the biggest thing though, is they're just fighting against racism. This idea that many people believe that African Americans were inferior. They were inferior intellectually and morally, and so there was this constant fear of them. And in something that I don't truly understand, and I don't really think I can comment on, is the biggest fear was this idea of mixing the races. And so that's the reason they kept the schools segregated. They were afraid that the white people and the not white people might date and marry and start having children. And for some reason, that just totally freaked a lot of people out. So they had to keep them separate in social settings so that they wouldn't become too familiar with each other and actually start liking each other and dating and looking little googly eyes at each other and doing some things like that. So they put in all these rules to do this. They put in the loitering rules so they could continue to exploit the labor. So going back to the NAACP, one of the things that W.E.B. Du Bois promoted was something called the talented tenth. said that the top 10% of African Americans should go to college, and they should go, and they don't need to get vocational skills. They should become doctors and lawyers. And when they're lawyers, they should go and take these people to court to overturn some of these terrible laws. When they're doctors, they should, see patients. When they should be teachers, they should be doing all of these things that many racists believed that African Americans were not intellectually capable of doing. That they believed that a black could not understand the law, that a black could not teach, that they weren't intelligent enough. And so it says, we're going to go to school and we're going to demonstrate to you that our top 10% is just as good as your top 10%. And so, and in doing so, then go and take professional jobs in integrated situations. And so, I guess the long and the short of it is, I don't want people to think that the civil rights movement just sort of cropped up out of nowhere. It didn't. The first real big success of the civil rights movement is going to be Sweatt v. Texas, which desegregates the University of Texas. And then shortly after that, you're going to have Brown v. Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall was educated at a historically black college on scholarship from the NAACP, and he worked for the NAACP Legal Fund. And so these things that are beginning, these civil rights that are beginning during the Gilded Age, during this progressive era, while they're not going to see a lot of immediate success, they will eventually grow into having some success in the 50s and the 60s. Unfortunately, for so many people, that's probably going to be a little too late. It is going to be a little too late. African Americans, if you think that immigrants were treated badly, and they were, African Americans were treated horribly, it's a stain on our country's legacy and on our history, the way that race relationships happened, especially during this time period. There's actually going to be in the 1920s, right after the end of the Gilded Age, and during the Gilded Age before that, there will actually be more African Americans lynched than there were in the years immediately following the Civil War. In other words, for African Americans, in terms of being able to live to adulthood, they had a better chance of living to adulthood after the Civil War, in the years after the Civil War, than they did in the early 1900s. And that's a pretty sad situation. All right, I'll talk to you in class. Until then, have a good evening.